You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Edna Zhou, a journalist who has covered and worked with the Olympics all over the world. She's here to talk about the French relationship to sports and working out as we navigate the word sportif. So in the lead up to the Olympics, I am super excited to welcome Edna Zhou onto the podcast today. Edna, thank you so much for joining me. And could you give our listeners just a little bit of a background as to who you are, what you do, and what your connections are to France and to the world of sports?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and growing up, my childhood dream was always to work for the Olympics. And so everything I did kind of as a teenager going into adulthood was prepping for some sort of career related to international sport or diplomacy. So after college, I moved to China first and then Singapore. And while I was in Singapore, I ended up volunteering with the Singapore Youth Olympics. And through that, I got connected to this international sports world. And one day at an event, this Italian boss is like, if only you spoke French, we'd hire you. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm 21. I can move to France. Why not? Like, very naive. So I started looking for jobs in Francophone countries, any that would take me. Ended up just getting an au pair job in Paris. So in 2012, I moved to Paris. That's where I met you. And then I was an au pair for a year and a half while also becoming a sports journalist. So I went to London and Sochi as a sports journalist, then moved to Italy as a sports journalist. That didn't work out so well. Became a travel writer, moved to China, moved to New Zealand, moved to a bunch of places, including Thailand for the last 4 years. And then in between, I was also just freelancing, did a show for the BBC and have worked on my blog and done a bunch of editing. So I've been involved in the media space for most of my time abroad, but then I was always back to France whenever I could. I'd always come to visit. I'd spend, a couple months while I was freelancing. So I felt like part of my heart got left behind in Paris, and the sports world is always very dear to me, even though my last Olympics was in 2018, Pyeongchang.
Oh, wow. So you've had a lot of time working in and around the world of high-level sports. And I know that you also, in your time here in France, did some sports playing. You can tell that I am definitely not a sports ball type. But I'm going to do my best here. And so I'm really curious in our conversation today to kind of address some of the ways that sports are culturally perceived in France as compared to some of the many, many, many other places that you've lived. And obviously, myself coming from the US, I've lived briefly in Canada, but I mean, most of my time has been spent between France and the US. So, one of the major differences that I always saw was in the phrasing. In France, you say faire du sport, the way that French people frame going to the gym, but it's also playing sports. And there's a big difference in English between like playing sports or like doing sport in the UK and like working out. So it led me to sort of wonder if you get the impression that the French conceive of working out differently than English speakers do.
Yeah, I mean, so to preface, I haven't lived in France for a while, so I think things, have obviously changed or could change in the last few years. But I noticed when I was there that, athleisure wasn't the thing. You don't go out really and show off, your Lululemon and you're like working out. Like in America, I feel, and a lot of maybe other Anglo cultures, it's more like, yeah, I'm going to the gym. I'm hitting my like F45. I'm closing my rings. It feels like this whole separate entity and culture to like gym culture. You're following your Peloton instructor on Instagram and all that versus, oh, I'm playing sports. This is a thing that I'm doing to win or lose. It's more for the camaraderie or the aspect of winning and strategy versus like, I'm just here at the gym to like get my steps in.
And I think, I mean, obviously, like you mentioned, there has been an evolution. Like when I first moved here, you would never see French people running in the Luxembourg Gardens, for example. And now you do. So there's definitely change happening. But I do kind of wonder, like in the way that you were talking about the way that English speaking people, Anglo people frame their workouts, there is this like competition mindset. There's this like performative mindset. Did you get the same sense from the French people that you knew when you were here about, you know, the way that they related to sports or the gym or working out?
Yeah, I feel like a really good example is like the kid that I was an au pair to. His parents were, you know, fabulously wealthy, very well to do. They wanted their son to be well-rounded. So throughout the week, he had tennis lessons and swimming lessons and golf lessons. And I think I'm missing one more sport. Oh, and he played soccer, you know, but none of it was, he was 8, right? None of it was like, we need our son to be like built, you know, it was just, well, these are important aspects of community. These are pillars that you can cling to as you grow older. And so it's important for you to get involved now, to know the rules so that you can, you know, be fluent in them culturally, be, you know, socially accepted, you know, when you're older. And so I feel like that's the sense I get from most people in France that I knew, and pretty much most people outside of the US. I feel like the US is very special in that kind of like competitive mindset, whereas a lot of other places I've lived, it's been more community focused of like, yeah, it's nice if you're good at it, but we're not aiming for you to become, you know, an NCAA champion or get drafted into the MLB. Like this is for community and for your future as an adult.
Absolutely. And I mean, that is making me think as well. Like when I first came here and I was in high school, I was very surprised to find that like French high schools don't have a football team. Like it's not like a thing to go to the game on a Saturday.
Wow. Yeah. And that's such like a staple of, I feel, American high schooldom, you know?
Totally. And maybe it's a little bit more present in other countries, like, I don't know, the UK, maybe they have more of like a big game culture, but like, yeah, it's more of about having fun, maybe.
Yeah. Like, I mean, think about how often you're walking around Paris and you're just seeing some old dudes playing pétanque, you know? Like, I'm sure some of those pétanque games get heated, but nowhere to the level of like the rivalries you see in like, what's that called when they're out in the parking lot? The pre-gaming.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? I forget what that's called, but yeah, when they're out.
Tailgate?
Yes, when they're tailgating. Yeah, the pétanque is never getting as heated as the tailgating.
That is true. That is very, very true. And pétanque players, I mean, a very present sport that you see just around Paris, also depending on where you are, like tennis. I know you can get tennis courts in a lot of the parks. A lot of people playing like pickup soccer. But then like, you know, I know you joined like a sports team when you were here, right? To build community and to play. It was Gaelic football, right?
Yeah, so that was my thing. I started playing Gaelic football, which is an Irish sport. That's kind of like this mix hybrid between rugby and volleyball and football and a bit of basketball. But ultimately, you have to be very hand-eye coordinated to play this game. But because the Irish never really expect anyone to play it, there are teams all over the world. But I quickly learned that they're just so happy to find anyone willing to play their like chimera sport that they're very welcoming. So when I moved to Paris, first thing I did was, you know, join the Gaelic football team just to build a community. And sure enough, they were very welcoming and they helped me, you know, get acclimated to Paris. And I think something you brought up, it made me think too. I think in France and other countries, sports is so, you know, socially oriented. And in the US, a lot of sports the goal is to become pro. You know, I feel like a lot of parents put their kids into sports, and maybe in the UK too, you know, if you watch that Beckham documentary of like, okay, this kid is my ticket out. Like, we're going to become rich. We're going to get millions in endorsements and contracts. Like, your goal is to make it to the Olympics or a team, you know, something with a lot of money. And you see that even in the way that I feel US sports facilities are way more, you know, capitalized. You know, you can't just play a pickup game. It's much harder. You have to pay a fee. You have to be a member of somewhere. You can't just like show up to a court and like be like, I want to play some tennis. Someone's going to run out and be like, do you belong? What's your name? You know?
Okay, that's really interesting. And did you encounter that at all with your Gaelic football, or was that mostly Irish people playing? And
No. So what I loved about Gaelic football was that no one in Ireland is pro. It's a purely amateur sport.
Oh, that's nice.
So you can be the best of the best, and they have, a following as if it is a massive sport in the States, like, the NFL. They have their championship games every, I think, August. It's a huge thing. Like the Irish friends I had in Asia, we'd always stay up late to watch it. But the players don't get paid. They're purely amateur, and they do it for like the love of the game.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
Yeah, I respect it a lot, actually. Because then, your heart is, not to sound too lofty, but your heart's in it for the right place, I played with some really, so like the top levels, like all Ireland. And so when I was playing Gaelic in China and Singapore and all that, a lot of their top people played at the all Ireland level, but then they're also, math teachers and bankers and just like very normal corporate day jobs as well.
Oh man, that's really cool.
But I had a thought too that in France, I feel like you can really go to a pickup game. You can just hang out. It's a very social sport. And there's kind of it's built into society too, that like as you age, you can do adult teams. You can have your pétanque league or whatever. And in the US, you can't. And I was thinking it's also because of things like health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed so many of my friends don't do things because they're like, well, my health insurance won't cover that. My deductible is too high. If I, break my wrist, then I won't have health insurance, or I'm out of a job and then I lose my health insurance. Like it's such a subconscious weight that's always here. When I moved to Denver for a year, I was working for AmeriCorps, which is, a nonprofit. They pay you very little. You have to be on food stamps. Like that's their whole thing. It's on purpose. But I couldn't afford health insurance. And so I didn't join the Gaelic football team because I was like, if I hurt myself at all, like I can't work this job. And then I had picked up a second job and I was like, I can't work that job either. And so you see that in the US too, where then because of that, the paperwork to join anything is larger. I tried signing up for a Gaelic football team in Chicago and they're like, cool, here are like 6 different documents you have to sign and get back to us. You have to register with the US GAA League, blah, blah, blah. You have to prove your health insurance, sign this, sign that. Whereas every other country I've played in, they're like, you have a mouth guard? You have a passport? Cool. Show up at this time, at this day. Like, that's it, So I think that's also kind of a hindrance to sports in America being as casual and as leisurely as it could be, and as we see in France, because you have to go through all of these hoops and hurdles first. It's not just a casual, like, yeah, let's go play for fun.
I never even thought about that. And it's interesting too, because so much of if you are playing adult sports as an adult in America, it is often through work. Like you have a softball league and it's your office softball league.
Right.
Whereas here, like where I go and spend summers in the South, there's like adult men playing rugby on the weekends and they might definitely lose a tooth. And that's nothing to do with their job at all.
Yeah. And even just like, I feel that competitiveness and the health insurance comes out. For example, if you're going to the beach, I don't really see people like picking up a game of volleyball with strangers. It's more like you get your friends together and then you're like, hey, let's go to the volleyball, area at the beach. Whereas I feel like other places I've been, I'm thinking more like Asia, New Zealand, it was more likely to just rock up to a beach and be like, all right, I have a volleyball. Who wants to play? Strangers. And again, it really changes a lot that you don't think about when you just have health insurance taken care of. You don't have to worry about it.
That is a very good point. I think I've seen definitely, I don't know if I've noticed the volleyball thing because I'm usually reading when I'm on the beach, but I definitely have noticed people joining like soccer games. And I know there's very complicated politics around pétanque and who's allowed to play with whom. But definitely I've seen people like just join in like a soccer football game in like a park somewhere.
Yeah, there's a freedom in that. Just being like, yep, I don't know your skill level. You could, just tackle me and end me today, but I would be okay if that happened. Let's have fun.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? Don't miss This takes you beyond the typical and the obvious, with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Every Monday, you'll get 20 to 35 new Parisian events with descriptions, links, and all the details sent directly to your inbox. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Sign up for Don't Miss This on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.
Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. So another sort of element of sports culture that I find really interesting, especially, when you change countries, is the way that people feel about their local sports team. And I think you kind of brushed up against this when you were talking about the way that, parents are hoping their kids are going to go pro. Like, I did an episode a while ago on terroir, and my guest was talking about how a lot of French people feel about their region and their region's like products or food or wine, the way that a lot of Americans feel about our sports teams. And so I was just curious, when you are watching sports in France, I know that people watch a lot of what, we here call football, what we would call soccer in the States, or rugby. Do you get the sense that they have that sense of like identifying with their team to the same extent, or are they watching it more, to see the professionalism or the non-professionalism of the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's some of A, some of B. Like, I think it's natural human nature to feel some sort of pride over where you're from, or some loyalty, or even just, my dad liked this team or my mom liked this team, so I am too. I know I haven't really watched people watching like the smaller, like say Marseille versus Toulouse games, it's more, World Cup or Euros or Olympics. And of course, people are decked out in their blue jerseys and their Mbappe jerseys, But I think in what I've noticed, the big difference is that like the US, the culture is more present outside of games. I feel like in France, when the games are on, they're like, yeah, go France, allez les bleus. And they're like totally tuned in. And then when the game's over, they're like, okay, a little bit of celebration. Like I was there and the World Cup happened in 2018 and, people were on the Bastille and like on cars and like that does happen. But then it's kind of back to, let's talk about food. Let's talk about art, whatever. And in the US, it's much more, let's talk about sports all the time. My father-in-law, for example, it's, if I don't really know what else to say to him, it's just kind of I know sports is a for sure stake in the ground that we can be tied to and be like, did you see the Cardinals last night? I also know like whenever I get on a flight that's headed back to the US in any airport in any country, I can immediately tell that it's heading to the US because I start seeing people wearing sports jerseys.
Oh, yeah.
The baseball hats, and you're like, oh, that guy's from Kansas City, or oh, that person's a Pittsburgh fan. I don't really get that from any other country. Maybe occasionally like a rugby jersey or a soccer jersey, but like by and large, the Americans are like dominating that sports jerseys in public kind of market.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, the baseball caps, I feel like you see people wearing Yankees caps here, and I don't think they even know that they're Yankees caps. I think they think they're New York caps.
Yeah, like that's very much a fashion statement for sure, I think.
Circling back to that particular World Cup, I remember actually, speaking of identity and kind of unity and community, when France won that World Cup, Trevor Noah came out and said something. He made a joke about how like Africa had won the World Cup for France.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of the players came forward and sort of decried him and said, no, we're French first and French always. And there has been quite a bit of like a trend over time talking about sort of mixity on the French team and it being kind of a great equalizer. Have you encountered any of that in France, of the way that it's sort of a way in which we reckon with racial diversity in France?
So I've seen, articles and things about it. And I think at a high level, it's what we all want. It's the same with, I think his name is Marcus Ashford in the UK, but I'm not sure, and in the US as well, like, wow, look at this great equalizer. We're all on the same team. But ultimately, it's kind of like how when Andy Roddick there's someone who's Scottish and it's like when he wins, the UK are like, oh yeah, for the UK. And when he loses, they're like, well, he's Scottish.
Oh yeah.
I think unfortunately, the reality that I've seen for the most part is still when it suits you and you can celebrate, then like, yeah, we'll take them, they're ours. But then when they, miss a penalty or when they get, a foul, suddenly it's boo. And there's suddenly, racial things coming out. I know in France and the Italian team, there have definitely still been some ugly, ugly racial things happening at stadiums and things being said. So it's like, yes, high level, you can say you're all for it, but not everyone is there yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I get the same too, even being like, I'm Chinese American. And so people kind of claim me as American or Chinese when it suits them as well, and it's frustrating. I want to say you can't have both, but it's always going to happen, I think.
Right. When it comes to the Olympics specifically for Paris, do you get the sense, having worked at multiple Olympic Games, Olympics high. Do you get the sense that it represents anything in particular for France as opposed to what it might have represented for some of the other countries where you've covered the Olympics?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay. So for background, like I did Singapore and then London, Sochi as journalists, and then Rio and Pyeongchang I did working for the organizing committees on the media team. So I've seen it from both sides and in like a variety of different cities. And Paris definitely falls more in line, in my mind, as the London side of, hey, we had it twice in the past. Let's have it again in the 21st century, modernize it, kind of remind people like, hey, we're more than just the stereotypes of our city. It's ultimately going to be cool to see things like swimming in the Seine, even if you don't want to think about like, ew, gross, it's the Seine.
Mm-hmm.
The pictures coming out from test events where they're high diving next to the Eiffel Tower, they're playing volleyball next to Hotel de Ville. Like, of course, those images are next level. But at the same time, yeah, you think about like Singapore had the first Youth Olympics, and that was kind of, some people didn't really know much about Singapore, where it was, if they had a sports culture. Rio, much can be said about places like Rio and Pyeongchang, where, as with any Olympics, you get into, should the money have been spent this way? Was this the best thing for this economy and the people? But some of the positives I did see was, introducing some infrastructure that hadn't been there before and really introducing kids to sport. In Rio, I was working the water polo venue, the venue that had the green pool. That was mine.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah, but when the water polo was going on, like I remember I became friends with some of the water polo reporters. And they were telling me all about the kids in the stands that they were talking to who were suddenly like, I'm interested now. I actually started swimming, or I started taking lessons. I'm joining a water polo team. Like, I think the exposure, especially in those kind of countries and places, is really cool. And, obviously awesome that Paris will be hosting. I'm sure there will still be many people and communities and kids who will be exposed to sports that they otherwise wouldn't have. But those are the differences you get when you have a London and a Paris versus like a Rio and a Singapore.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about in Paris, or a lot of what I've been hearing, because I work in tourism. So I think people have been saying, Paris really didn't need this spotlight on it.
Yeah. I know my photographer friends have been, posting photos of like, well, just know if you're here right now, we can't really take pictures by the Eiffel Tower. We're going to have to choose different places. Like it definitely, I see the scaffolding going up because a lot of my friends are still there and I see their Instagram stories and it's like, wow, yeah, this is all infrastructure.
When Paris is communicating about these games, I see a couple of different things coming up. One of them is gender parity, with as many women competing as men. Is that something that you feel, is significant when it comes to sport in France specifically? Or is this just something that was a long time coming that's finally happened and it just so happens to have happened in Paris?
Yeah, it's more the latter. I remember even going back to London or Singapore, they already had the statistics out for journalists of like, hey, these athletes are this percent men, this percent women. And every year it would come closer and closer to parity. So like, yes, hugely important. Many women still are not getting the same treatment, facilities, pay, access, all of those things. And it's so important. But I wouldn't say it's not because of Paris that this happened. This had been rolling for a while. And I think the IOC had been making it a priority to get them to parity.
That's really good news.
Yeah, fantastic.
Another thing I'm hearing a lot about in terms of communicating about the Paris Games specifically is sort of the climate awareness of something this big. And obviously, Paris being the home of the climate accord, I think that people have been thinking about how to use pre-existing infrastructure and how to, reduce the climate effects of the games in getting everything ready to welcome all of these people. Is that something that you think is, something that the games in general have been working towards, and it just so happens that it's calcifying in Paris? Or do you think that the Paris Climate Accord had any effect on the way that the games are sort of getting set up here?
Yeah, this one I think actually is the latter. This one I think I would probably give Paris some credit for. I hadn't really seen it as prioritized in other games that I've been to. Maybe it was there and I just didn't see it. But I feel like Paris, especially knowing the history of Anne Hidalgo, I think has been pretty forward thinking on the ways that she's turned Paris into more climate friendly or more walkable. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't stayed that up to date on.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I feel like every time I came back to Paris, there were actually more pedestrianized roads. There were more streets that had been taken away from cars. And I think that's really great that they've, kind of put their money where their mouth is. And it's we're hosting a massive event. There's a large carbon footprint. A lot of people are flying in for this. There's going to be a carbon footprint just erecting and then disassembling all of these structures. So it's good that they're taking that into account, especially when all the scientists are kind of saying hey, climate change is happening at a way faster rate than we thought it would.
Yeah. Where you and I kind of intersect on this is I just covered the restaurant that they're building for the games, where they're welcoming, 3 very, very mediatized chefs to cook for the Olympians. They're going to cook in what they're calling the biggest restaurant in the world.
Oh.
And obviously, France being the country of gastronomy, it's unsurprising that they're focusing this much on the food. But there's very little of that food as fuel mindset in France generally.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just curious, if we bring it sort of back to the culture around sports in general, do you get the sense that the French, and I know we're generalizing, but we always have to generalize on this podcast, which is uncomfortable, but do you get the sense that they treat food as fuel, that they think about the relationship between fitness and food in the same way as someone, for example, in the States would?
I mean, again, to generalize, right. I know this is not everyone, but generally, I do not see that at all. I remember moving to France and suddenly eating way more bread and butter and cheese than I ever had in my entire life. And I was still I felt healthier than I ever had, and it's because I was walking everywhere and the quality of the food was better. And the first time I went back to the States after living in France for a few months, I still remember so clearly my parents took me to a restaurant. I think it was the Olive Garden, and I had my usual chicken pasta, and I was oh, this chicken is sweet. I could taste the difference. And the yogurt was sweet. Everything just felt so syrupy, and I was okay, they're not lying about the whole. And I would see people generalizing well, European food is better. I was oh, okay, no, I get it now. I see where those rules and regulations actually make a difference. I would also say in the US, so every time I'm back in the US visiting, or even if I just have my VPN on and I'm watching a show with American commercials, so much of the media messaging is around how you look and what you're eating. And are you thinking about your calories? You're not? Well, you should be. Have you heard of keto? Are you doing paleo? Are you intermittent fasting? These are not things that I would otherwise ever think about. And I feel grateful that I grew up in a family household that, for all of its problems, did not ever really talk about weight or appearance, because then I could just view food as this is delicious. I would like to eat more of it, and not have to think about well, is this the right fuel? Are there enough fuel numbers? I think I've seen friends go through that, and it's just a really, it's a heavy way to live. It's a debilitating way. It really weighs you down. And when food can be so enjoyable, to kind of have that weight around you, I guess no pun intended, but it can take away from that.
Absolutely. Edna, thank you so very much for joining me on the podcast today. This has been enlightening, and I'm so glad that we got to chat. For anybody who is listening who wants to read more of your work, find out where in the world you are, which is always a hard thing to figure out, where can people find you?
I am best reached on Instagram at expatedna.
Excellent. And are you still writing, still freelancing, writing about sports?
No longer writing about sports as much, mostly writing. I'm doing a lot of freelance stuff that no longer goes on my blog just because you know how it is. It pays a little better, but I would like to get to a spot where I can go back to just throwing random thoughts on the blog.
Amazing. Well, in the meantime, people can give you a follow on Instagram. We'll put that link in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks, Emily. You too.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.